Video games have come a long way. From once being seen as a temporary fad, to just toys for children, or immoral corrupters of the youth, today, the gaming industry easily surpasses the film and music industries combined, and it's still growing. Still, as tempting as it might be to draw comparisons to more established industries, the reality is that video games have proved to be something unique. No other industry has been so closely tied to technological progress. No industry has ever grown so far, so fast, and no other industry has experienced so much change in such a short time. With multi-billion-dollar companies rising and falling in the space of a few years, and the entire gaming landscape being radically changed more than once by a couple guys working out of a garage. And all this in something that's only been around about 50 years. Video games have come a long way, and their evolution has been remarkable. Today though, more and more people seem to be viewing the industry with pessimism, and despite continued growth, its future doesn't look quite as bright as it once did, with companies and consumers alike increasingly seeming to be looking to the past. So, let's talk about the past. All of it. From the very first game, right up to where we are today, and every major event in between. This is the entire history of video games, and it begins with something that would end up as a bit of a staple for the industry. War. World War II was kind of a big deal. In addition to deciding the fate of a global population and shaping the modern world as we know it, it also saw rapid technological advancement that would pave the way for something equally important: video games. After building the first ever digital computers for the purpose of numerical processing and code breaking as part of the war effort, this technology was subsequently commercialized and found its way to several universities. And where computers go, video games soon follow. Of course, they weren't exactly designed as video games, so much as demonstrations to show what computers could do, or just experiments to further the field of computer science. The first of these shown to the public was Bertie the Brain in 1950, who played tic-tac-toe. Poor Bertie was apparently quite good, although every photo seems to show him losing, and he was dismantled 2 weeks after the exhibition, as tended to be the case with these early computers. The first game to be created as entertainment was 1958's Tennis for Two, a side-on simulation of a game of tennis that ran on an analog computer and was created by William Higginbotham, a man perhaps better known for his role in the creation of the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, in 1962, Space War, a two-player 1v1 space battle simulation created at MIT, became the first game to see wider distribution as its source code was shared between students and institutions. As the 60s continued, more games were created for the mainframe and mini-computers of the era, but their popularity was quite limited by the fact that the computers needed to run these games cost thousands and thousands of dollars, something affordable for a university, but less so for the average family. Things would change in the 1970s, however, as video games started to appear alongside pinball machines and other mechanical games in arcades. The first arcade video game was Computer Space in 1971, which took heavy inspiration from the earlier Space War and was designed by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Danby. Computer Space saw limited success, but its creators still believed in the potential of the medium, so they founded their own company, Atari. At the same time as this, new breakthroughs were happening elsewhere, as in 1972, the first ever home console was released by electronics company Magnavox. It was called the Odyssey, and its development started 6 years earlier, with the version finally released being the 7th successive prototype. The main challenge the team faced was affordability. The technology for a home console existed. It was just a question of how to keep the price low enough that anyone would be willing to manufacture or buy it. But eventually, the team led by Ralph Baer found a way, and so video games, at long last, came to the American family home. This was an important milestone, although the Odyssey didn't exactly see the runaway success of later consoles. Still, its simple two-player table tennis game did provide the inspiration for Atari's first game, the remarkably similar-looking future phenomenon, Pong. Released in arcades in late 1972, Pong was a game that changed gaming, proving immensely popular in arcades and, at 25 cents a game, also immensely profitable.
By the end of '72, we did $3.5 million. And then we did 19 million, and then we did 35 million. It was a hockey stick.
In fact, Pong was so popular that the first machine installed quickly stopped working. Atari were called out to get it going again, and found the problem was that the cash box had overflowed from the vast amount of quarters, leading the machine to become jammed. And so, arcades exploded in popularity as Pong proved gaming's potential. Video games had arrived, and at the birth of this exciting new medium where the possibilities are endless, how did everyone react, you might wonder? Well, obviously, they copied the one thing everyone knew already worked. Atari made sequels and successors, as well as their own dedicated home Pong console, and other companies made their own versions alongside their own sequels and successors and dedicated home systems. Pong was everywhere, as profit led to proliferation, and before long, video games were in decline. By the mid-1970s, arcade growth slowed and then shrunk as the market became saturated with Pong clones, and brand new companies that had once rushed to cash in on this big new thing started going under. Atari themselves fared better, although they had their own troubles by way of a lawsuit that came from Magnavox over the striking similarities between Pong and their table tennis game. Atari settled, but they weren't the only ones being sued, and Magnavox's winnings ended up totaling over $100 million. And so, arcades were struggling, but thanks to technological advancements over the 70s, a new prize was up for grabs, and the competition would be intense. Arcades might have been where video games got their start, but home consoles offered an even greater opportunity, and people were quick to realize it. In 1975, the year Atari's home Pong released, there were 7 other companies releasing home video game consoles of their own. By 1977, there were at least 82 other companies, with 160 different models being released in that year alone. The consoles from this era were dedicated systems, meaning they could only play one or more built-in games that came included. A lot of these were simply Pong clones, with Atari even taking measures to make the cloning process more difficult to hinder their rivals.
We actually became quite diabolical about seeing ways that we could just mess them up. We put a chip in and we purposefully mismarked it so that when somebody copied us, they put the wrong chip in.
This didn't stop the market from becoming saturated, however, but this time a solution would come through innovation, and once more it would be Atari who led the way.
Okay, Atari, let's see your best pitch. You're out, Rose!
The Atari video computer system is 20 cartridges with 1,300 game variations you play on your own TV set.
The Atari Video Computer System, later called the Atari 2600, released in 1977, 1 year after the Fairchild Channel F became the first ever console to feature interchangeable cartridges. Bushnell saw the advantages cartridges provided and rushed to produce a cartridge-based system of his own, but earlier problems with lawsuits, increasing competition, and decline in arcade sales meant Atari's funds were getting low, and so they made a deal with Warner Communications to sell Atari for $28 million. The consequences of this deal would be seen most clearly in the following years, but for now, it meant Atari had the money to finish their new console to beat out their main rival Magnavox, who would release their own cartridge-based system, the Odyssey 2, in 1978. The Atari 2600 would be huge, with lifetime sales of over 30 million units, a number that dwarfs any other console of the era. Still, this success came slowly, and in late 1977, the entire gaming industry experienced its first, but by no means last, crash. The combination of a saturated market full of dedicated systems, alongside new cartridge-based systems that proved far more desirable, meant heaps of dedicated systems suddenly stopped selling, leaving retailers with a surplus of stock they couldn't shift, and causing game developers to cancel most dedicated systems that were currently in development. The resulting downturn hit the gaming industry hard, leading economists and media figures to speculate whether the entire gaming industry had simply been a short-lived craze that was now coming to the end of its life cycle. Amidst this pessimism, the Atari 2600, with its relatively high price point of $200, which is almost $1,000 after adjusting for inflation, was seen as a tough sell, and retailers and consumers alike were hesitant to embrace it, meaning Atari was only able to sell a fraction of the systems they manufactured in its first few years. Further competition would also come from other cartridge-based systems, including the Intellivision from Mattel and the ColecoVision from Coleco. But Atari would soon find the killer app they needed that would not only get themselves back in business, but would also get the entire gaming industry back on track. Space Invaders was created by Japanese developer Tomohiro Nishikado at Taito in 1978, and it is easily one of the most important and influential games ever made. Before Space Invaders, different regions like America, Europe, and Japan had little crossover between them, but Space Invaders quickly moved beyond regional borders to become the first truly global gaming mega-hit, and that was by no means its only achievement. Its gameplay may look relatively simple today, but in the 70s it was anything but. As a fixed shooter where the player takes on rows of gradually descending aliens while hiding behind fully destructible bunkers, it was the first game to have enemies that shoot back at the player. It helped pioneer the move away from timers over to lives-based systems. It was the first game to feature a high score system, giving it potentially infinite replayability, and it was the first game to feature continuous background music. The background track itself was dynamic and increased in tempo in time with the enemy's increased movement speed as rounds progressed, giving the action a real sense of tension as the difficulty ramped up. This iconic part of the game wasn't actually intentional. During its development, Nishikado found that the arcade's processor struggled to handle so many enemies on screen at once, and yet, as the player took out more and more of them, the render speed increased, causing the aliens to move faster and faster. This created a difficulty curve where the challenge rose and fell within each level, to create moments of higher and lower intensity, a principle still seen in game design to this day. Space Invaders also featured some semblance of a story. Aliens were invading from space, and you had to stop them. Okay, it's not much, but compared to the more abstract Pong or Breakout, it made the action feel much more contextually meaningful and marked the beginning of arcade games paying more attention to these kinds of aspects. And if all that wasn't enough, there was also the game's sales. By 1982, Space Invaders had grossed $3.8 billion, which is over $13 billion after inflation. meaning it was the then best-selling video game and highest-grossing entertainment product of all time. For the industry, this meant video games were back. And soon, it wasn't just Space Invaders. 1978 marked the beginning of what has since been named the Golden Age of the arcade. 1979 saw the release of Asteroids from Atari, which continued the space battle theme, this time in an asteroid field with more complex physics-based movement, while also using cutting-edge vector graphics that utilized lines instead of pixels to provide a crisp display, unlike anything that could be produced on a home TV screen. The trend of popular arcade games where you shoot things continued in 1980, with Atari's 3D first-person tank sim Battlezone, as well as their trackball-controlled Missile Command, which took inspiration from the still ongoing Cold War to task players with defending cities from intercontinental ballistic missiles. 1981 gave the world Defender from Williams Electronics, which pioneered the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up genre, and Galaga from Namco, a fixed shooter which featured complex enemy patterns and power-ups, both features that would define the genre moving forward. Shooters weren't the only thing coming out of arcades though. In 1980, Namco's Pac-Man gave the world its first gaming mascot, Pac-Man, while establishing the maze chase genre and being the first game to feature power-ups. As iconic as he would go on to become, however, Pac-Man's path to success wasn't a simple one. The game initially struggled to beat Namco's 1979 space shooter Galaxian in Japan, while in America, publisher Midway was hesitant to manufacture many units as they were unsure how it would perform. The reason for this was that it didn't involve any shooting, and so executives feared it would be less popular with arcade's mostly male player base. This was something developer Toru Iwatani had also considered, as he'd deliberately tried to create a game that would appeal to women as well as men and offer something different to war or sports. Hence the colourful design, cute characters, and emphasis on eating rather than killing. Iwatani figured that girls like eating things more than killing them, and it seems he was onto something, because in the end, players couldn't get enough of Pac-Man's addictive pellet-eating action. Within a year, it had become the best-selling arcade game in both Japan and America, outgrossing even the 1977 film Star Wars in revenue. Pac-Man was one of the first, but by no means last times a video game found record success through broader appeal and targeting new audiences. Its use of vibrant colour and its focus on a central titular character would also go on to become video game staples and would soon be seen in other popular arcade titles like Konami's 1981 road and river crossing hit Frogger. By 1982, colour and 3D technology were being combined in even more impressive ways, like in Namco's visually striking racing simulator Pole Position. And the arcade golden age was in full swing, with profits from games reaching new heights, and Taito, Atari, and Namco establishing themselves as the three biggest developers around. Arcades were more than just a place to play games, however. Through features like high scores, multiplayer, and the ability to watch and compete in front of other people, arcades provided a social aspect to gaming that went beyond just playing. Much like how Twitch allows people to watch, discuss, and compete in various games today, arcades were the live streaming and esports of the 20th century, and they offered better gaming experiences than you could get in your home, with higher quality graphics, better sound, and unique immersive elements like wheels and pedals in racing game cabinets. Arcades would also have a significant impact on future game design. Their quarter-hungry monetization method has sometimes led to criticism over their high difficulty, with older console games also sometimes coming under fire for inheriting that high difficulty. But popular arcade titles knew that if difficulty was the only thing they had to offer, players wouldn't have any reason to keep coming back. and so they learnt how to make skill-based challenges fun and make players want to improve and keep playing. Still, as important as arcades were, Space Invaders' legacy goes beyond just kicking off the golden age of arcades and breaking sales records, because it also turned things around for the home video game market and Atari. In 1980, Space Invaders came to the 2600, allowing people to play the arcade classic from the comfort of their home. This was the first arcade to home console port, and it wouldn't be the last.
You're a starship captain in an asteroid field. Blast them with your lasers or wood up your shield. As a missile commander defending your city. If you're not quick enough, they'll show no pity. The invaders won't stop us from the skies they drop. Just keep coming.
3 out-of-this-world games from Atari, the #1 video computer system with more games than any other.
Everyone's gone Atari. The #1 video game.
Space Invaders for the 2600 became the first ever killer app, or system seller, in video game history, and it certainly sold systems, with Atari's consumer sales almost doubling to $200 million in the year it released, before skyrocketing to over $800 million in 1981, with Atari taking 65% of the global market share. And so, the great console battle royale that had defined so much of the 70s was over, and Atari was the runaway winner. A victory that proved to be surprisingly short-lived. In 1982, Atari was the fastest growing company in American history. Yet, by the end of 1983, they were one of the fastest falling, with yearly losses of over $500 million amidst the slide in parent company Warner's stock of almost 70%. In 1984, Atari was sold, with Warner receiving no cash for the sale, and never again would Atari be a leader in the video game industry. So, what happened? Well, there is an obvious answer, but that only tells part of the story. To really understand, we need to rewind a bit and look at where Atari came from. When Nolan Bushnell and Ted Danby decided to start a video game company together, they both pitched in $250 of their own money to get the company off the ground. By 1982, Atari had 10,000 employees and were bringing in $1.7 billion in operating profit. And this all happened in the space of around 10 years. Atari had a colourful history, and some important people once worked there, including Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who left after a few years to start their own company by the name of Apple, as well as a young programmer by the name of Bill Gates, who was fired for not doing enough work. Atari also had a bit of a reputation for their relaxed office culture. You know, flexible hours, informal dress code, the usual sort of thing.
Since we had a lot of young people, we would constantly offer to throw a party if they hit quota. And it turns out when you've got 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they're much more interested in the party than an extra, 50 cents an hour. So we got known as a party company.
There's a story that if you walked by the Borrega Street building and you breathed deeply by the air vents, you'd get stoned because the pot smoking inside of it was so heavy.
This made them a popular place to work, but it didn't last. The gaming industry was at the cutting edge of technology, which meant to compete and to win, funding was necessary. Hence the move to become a subsidiary of Warner in 1976, which brought in a $120 million cash injection and made the 2600's 1977 release possible. Warner Communications were a big business, however, meaning they took a keen interest in how their new subsidiary was being run. To this end, Warner brought in an experienced business exec, Ray Kassar, in 1978 to help with marketing and commercialization. But as the influence of Warner grew, So too did conflict with then CEO Nolan Bushnell, particularly over Bushnell's desire to continue to invest in research and development for new, technologically superior consoles. This ultimately led to Bushnell's departure in late 1978. He would go on to found American restaurant chain Chuck E. Cheese, and Atari went on to soaring new heights, now with a more professional work culture under the oversight of Kassar. Conflict wouldn't end here, however. Atari was succeeding, but they were also changing, and not everyone was happy with their new direction. In 1979, 4 experienced Atari programmers, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, resigned over Atari's policy to not credit or provide royalties to the actual game developers.
These engineers would create a software program that would result in $20–30 million in sales. And they were making this little paltry salary, and they figured, gee, I'd like to get a penny or 2 or 3 per each cartridge.
So we go to the president of Atari and point that out, and he said to us, and I'll quote, he said, "You are no more important to that game than the person on the assembly line who puts it together."
So they figured if they weren't going to get credit for their work, why do that work for someone else? Which led them to form their own company, Activision, the first ever third-party developer who made sure to emphasize the role of game creators on their products. Atari responded like the true corporate powerhouse they were at this time and sued Activision, but they weren't successful at preventing them from producing games for Atari consoles, and instead a deal was agreed where the third-party company would pay a portion of their sales as a license fee to the console owner, a system that's existed ever since. Activision were only the start of Atari's problems though. Other senior developers would also jump ship, but it was in early 1982 that marked the beginning of the end, when Atari tried to repeat the earlier magic of their Space Invaders and Asteroids arcade ports with Pac-Man for the 2600. The problem was, Pac-Man was no Space Invaders or Asteroids. Released originally in 1980, it ran on 1980s arcade technology, with vibrant colour, smooth animations, and high-quality sound. All things the now dated 2600 struggled with. The result is a port that will forever live in infamy as one of the worst of all time, a Pac-Man in name and not much else. Still, Atari's disappointments that year were only just getting started. November saw the release of the 5200, Atari's next generation home system, which kicked off the 16-bit era. Unfortunately, despite being early to the market, there wasn't much else the 5200 had going for it. Its initial price point of $270 was high, it didn't originally come with backwards compatibility, there were few new titles released for it, and the controller was widely criticized. And while its graphics and hardware were a step up from the 2600 and other 8-bit systems, the upgrade they provided was small and poorly shown by the few titles the 5200 had available, which tended to just be ports of 2600 games. Nolan Bushnell is reported to have left Atari over disagreements with the direction of future console technology, and the commercial failure of the Atari 5200 seemed to vindicate his stance. Finally, to top Atari's year off, there was E.T., which released just in time for the holiday season.
Only from Atari. Made especially for systems from Atari. The video game that lets you help E.T. get home. Just in time for Christmas. Happy holidays from Atari.
E.T. has regularly been called the worst video game of all time. This may be rather harsh, but history is rarely known for its kindness. Still, worst of all time or not, E.T. is certainly symbolic, and it's a perfect example of the hubris that brought Atari's downfall. Atari had acquired a license, at high cost, for an ET game following the success of the movie, but they wanted the game released in time for Christmas to take advantage of increased holiday sales. This meant a development time of only a few months, and so they brought in experienced developer Howard Scott Warshaw, who had just completed the ambitious and critically acclaimed Yar's Revenge. Warshaw embraced the short development time as a unique challenge and tried to do the miraculous. He failed, and the result is a confusing adventure game that had little connection to the original movie beyond its strangely shaped protagonist. This didn't faze Atari, however, who skipped audience testing to save time and produced an optimistic 5 million copies for retailers, only a fraction of which ended up selling. E.T. was a bad game, but in this way it wasn't unique. In fact, after the success of Activision, more and more developers entered the third-party space. This was before game developers needed a license to publish games on consoles, which created a free-for-all where quality was a much smaller concern than profit, and where accusations of industrial espionage and reverse engineering became rampant, due to third-party developers' lack of familiarity with the hardware of the system they were designing games for. By the start of 1983, at least 100 different companies were developing games for the 2600 in a rush to cash in on the now booming video game craze. In the process, quality control was often ignored, and in this period, consumers had few ways to differentiate between good and bad games before it was already too late. As the market continued to become increasingly saturated with low-quality games, retailers were forced to discount stock to try to get rid of these games, encouraging consumers to continue purchasing the now discounted bad games, leading to a loss of consumer confidence, which even video game titan Atari wasn't exempt from. In fact, Atari likely deserved more of the blame than anyone. Pac-Man for the 2600 was a bad game, but it was also the best-selling video game of all time. And even then, Atari still produced far more copies than they ultimately sold. And so, with a saturated market, little quality control, rapidly depleting consumer confidence, and even more emerging competition from the home computer market, the gaming industry did the inevitable and sunk spectacularly in the great gaming crash of 1983.
Video game sales have gone tilt. The boom simply isn't booming anymore.
If Pac-Man, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark aren't selling, what will?
To understand the scale of this disaster, it helps to look at the numbers. In 1983, home video game revenues peaked at $3.2 billion. By 1985, this number had fallen to 100 million, a decrease of almost 97%. Once quarterly earnings started to reveal the degree to which games had stopped selling, investors started panicking, cashing out their gaming stock, and effectively ending the supply of new money that had previously supported the once growing market. As a result, many newer gaming companies went bankrupt. Mattel, Coleco, and Magnavox all discontinued their gaming lines entirely, and Atari was sold for almost nothing, with hundreds of thousands of unsold games being famously dumped and buried in a landfill in New Mexico. Arcades still saw some popularity, but they once more entered into a period of decline, with the golden age having now come to an abrupt end. And so, video games were officially over, being once more seen as nothing but a short-lived fad, not so different from other popular toy lines that burn bright and then burn out once consumers get bored of them. And this is how they would continue to be seen in America for the next 2 years, until a new name entered the scene. While the American gaming industry crashed and burned in 1983, across the Pacific, in gaming's second largest market, the year would be remembered for a different reason: the release of the Nintendo Family Computer, also known as the Famicom. It wasn't until 1985 that Nintendo would bring their new console across the Pacific and rescue the American gaming industry, but for Nintendo, the story starts much earlier. Founded in 1889, Nintendo began life as a playing card manufacturer before diversifying into tabletop games and eventually electronic toys. Their first foray into video games came from making light gun accessories, but in 1977 they went a step further with the release of the Color TV game, a Japanese-only dedicated home console inspired by the success of Magnavox and Atari, which contained Pong in 6 different variants. In Nintendo's defense, at least they paid Magnavox for a license, unlike most. The Color TV game sold well, thanks in part to its modest price, and Nintendo went on to produce several more variants, all for their home market of Japan. They also entered the arcade space with a game based on the board game Othello. It was during this period that a fresh-faced 25-year-old by the name of Shigeru Miyamoto joined the company, but Miyamoto would not be Nintendo's first gaming superstar. That honor belongs to one Gunpei Yokoi, head of Nintendo's Research and Development 1 division and creator of the iconic handheld Game & Watch. Apparently inspired by Yokoi watching a bored businessman playing with an LCD calculator on a train, the Game & Watch was an early, dedicated handheld with an LCD display and fixed animations. It also pioneered the D-pad. Inexpensive and long-running, the Game & Watch's sales blew most early handheld competition out of the water, selling more units than even Atari's 2600 over the course of its lifetime. But Nintendo was only just getting started. After several less successful arcade attempts, the company's next big break came with 1981's Donkey Kong. Designed by Miyamoto with the oversight of Yokoi, it was originally developed as a way to reuse old cabinets of Miyamoto's previous and rather less successful radar scope. Donkey Kong took inspiration from Popeye and featured the titular ape as the game's barrel-throwing antagonist, alongside the player-controlled Jumpman, who would go on to become one of the most recognizable characters in the world after he was renamed to Mario. Donkey Kong was one of the earliest platformers and the first game to feature jumping. It also broke new ground in narrative design, featuring a complete storyline told entirely on screen, with Donkey Kong kidnapping Mario's girlfriend, who the player then works to rescue, before finally watching the two be reunited. It was also a massive hit, establishing Nintendo's name internationally and creating a bidding war between console rivals Atari and Coleco over the rights to publish it. Nintendo would follow Donkey Kong with multiple sequels, but it was their return to home consoles that would change the gaming industry forever. At first glance, the Famicom didn't look that remarkable. It was an 8-bit system in a time when Atari had already given the world 16 bits of power, and home computers were quickly becoming more powerful still. Yet the Famicom did have a dedicated picture processing unit in addition to its CPU, as well as a reasonable launch price of just under 15,000 yen. Its greatest asset would eventually be its game selection, but an impressive library took time, and the Famicom's first year on the Japanese market saw it get off to a slow start. It would pick up momentum eventually, however, and the Great Gaming Crash of 1983 didn't have nearly as large an impact on Japan as it did America, meaning by the end of 1984, Nintendo's Family Computer had become the best-selling console in Japan, and was well on its way to becoming Nintendo's greatest success yet. This still left Nintendo's toughest challenge though, America, which in 1985 was still reeling from the earlier crash, with confidence in video games at an all-time low. To get retailers to even stock their console, Nintendo had to make buyback deals in case of poor sales, But that still left the even bigger problem of selling the console in the first place. I mean, how do you sell a gaming console to a country that doesn't want anything to do with video games? Well, Nintendo's answer was to pretend that it was something different.
Will your family be the first to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? Will you be the first to see, to touch, to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot? He follows the commands you put on screen to help you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley? The first to build a library of game packs like Kung Fu and Golf? Even games like Excitebike that you program yourself. Will you be the first to get all this in one package? The Nintendo Entertainment System, where video technology is more than a game.
Enter the Nintendo Entertainment System. Not just a video game console, but something brand new. And it wasn't just about the name. The NES was designed to look like a video cassette recorder rather than a console. Its cartridges were rebranded as Game Packs, and it shipped with several accessories like the robotic operating buddy Rob and the iconic light gun, which marketing made sure to emphasize as much as possible. Nintendo's work didn't stop here though, as they had an entire gaming market to rebuild, and so the number one priority became restoring consumer trust in video games. To do this, they strictly controlled third-party development, putting limitations on companies to avoid the oversaturation that had plagued Atari. In Japan, this led to a growing bootleg market, so with the NES, Nintendo added a special lockout chip to combat this, while creating an official Nintendo Seal of Approval to allow buyers to identify Nintendo licensed products. And as for those products, Nintendo also paved the way for their console launch with arcade releases of the same games through the Nintendo Versus system in 1984, which was built on similar hardware to the Famicom. This not only helped spread Nintendo's name before the release of the NES, but also established the trend of console titles matching the quality of their arcade counterparts to try to repair the damage of games like Pac-Man for the 2600. Nintendo even shifted to using in-game-like box art in place of the detailed yet dissimilar artwork of so many earlier games. All this had an impact, but Nintendo had one final ace up their sleeve, which came once more from the mind of Shigeru Miyamoto and would mark the arrival of gaming's next killer app. Released in the same year as the NES, Super Mario Bros. Set a new standard. For years, players had grown accustomed to games taking place on a single screen, and then in came Mario, with side-scrolling platforming action across multiple screens, multiple levels, multiple environments, and all with different power-ups, boss fights, and jaw-dropping hidden secrets. To top it all off, Super Mario featured precise controls that took full advantage of Nintendo's new D-pad controllers, alongside detailed, vibrant visuals and one of the most iconic soundtracks in video game history from composer Koji Kondo. Mario even had a strong sense of identity. By this point in time, a lot of games had featured space combat, sport simulations, and fighting, but Mario offered something genuinely unique. You played as a shape-changing, mushroom-eating, turtle-stomping Italian plumber who warped between worlds while searching for a princess, and somehow the concept worked, with a childlike charm that appealed to all ages. And so, Super Mario Bros. Was a landmark title that kicked off the greatest-selling video game franchise of all time. But it's not like the NES only had Mario. In fact, only a year and a half later, the Nintendo Entertainment System would see the arrival of another gaming legend, once more from the mind of Miyamoto. The Legend of Zelda did to action-adventure games what Super Mario Bros. Did to platformers, With a massive fantasy world, fully open to players and packed with secrets, Zelda offered a sense of adventure and freedom to explore never before seen in a console game. It was also the first console game to feature a save system, thanks to battery-powered memory built into the game's cartridge, which helped support its more ambitious design. And once more, The Legend of Zelda was a huge critical and commercial success. As time went on, the NES's impressive library grew and grew, launching many of gaming's most loved series and establishing many of the rules of game design that would continue to be seen for years to come. Castlevania brought action-packed gothic horror, Metroid brought atmospheric sci-fi, Mega Man offered alternative high-quality platforming action, Metal Gear helped popularize the stealth genre, and Dragon Quest and, for later, Final Fantasy established the Japanese console role-playing genre. The NES was also well supported by high-quality arcade ports, like Ghosts and Goblins, Contra, and Double Dragon, as well as a range of Nintendo original sports games, providing even more diversity. Basically, the NES had everything, and it conquered the American and later European console markets, getting the gaming industry back in business in the process. This didn't happen overnight, and the damage done to the American market really was significant. But by 1989, the console market had finally bounced back close to earlier levels, with consumer confidence largely restored. Over its lifetime, the NES and Famicom sold around 62 million units, which was more than double the Atari 2600, making the NES the best-selling console of the time and still one of the best-selling to this day. And with Nintendo's console supremacy and so many American companies having exited the market following the earlier crash, Japan was able to take center stage of the gaming industry, with Nintendo's name becoming synonymous with video games. Still, even if Nintendo had taken a sizable lead, they wouldn't remain unchallenged for long, as another Japanese company was about to make their attempt at beating Nintendo at their own game. Sega was a big name in arcades. They entered the Japanese home console market at the same time as Nintendo, when the arcade golden age was starting to wind down. Their first console, the SG-1000, released in 1983, on the very same day as Nintendo's Famicom, but it would struggle to compete with Nintendo's superior system, likely as a result of Sega's inexperience with console development. In 1985, it was redesigned as the Sega Mark III, which released in North America in 1986 as the Sega Master System.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers.
Fresh!
And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The Master System went head-to-head with the NES, while copying much of its marketing strategy. In terms of hardware, it had a clear advantage, with a wider color palette and a small edge in raw power. But this wouldn't be enough to make up for its biggest weakness: its lack of third-party support. To publish games on the NES, licensees had to agree to a strict 2-year non-compete clause that didn't allow them to bring their titles to Nintendo's competition. This left the Master System with a much smaller library, and while Sega were able to bring their own first-party arcade titles, including the fast-paced rail shooter Space Harrier and iconic racing game Outrun, two of the best arcade titles of the mid-80s, this ultimately didn't prove to be enough, and even these games were still inferior on console than as arcade originals. This ensured that Sega failed to come close to matching Nintendo in Japan or North America, although they did do enough to overtake a flagging Atari, who, under new management, had released their own third-generation console, the 7800, a system notable for its innovative backwards compatibility and little else. Still, by this point, gaming was global, and so Sega turned their attention to other markets. In Europe, the NES had failed to achieve the same level of success as in America, with Nintendo taking a more hands-off approach and leaving the distribution to other companies. It also arrived notably late, with most countries not seeing the NES until 1987. This was the same year Sega brought over the Master System, and with no more head start and Sega's strong reputation as an arcade developer, Sega started to beat Nintendo for the very first time. By 1990, the Master System was Europe's best-selling console, and Sega didn't stop at Europe. In fact, a deal with toy and electronics company Tectoy saw Brazil become the Master System's single best-selling country after its release in 1989. By contrast, the NES didn't come to Brazil until 1993, giving Sega a unique chance to capture a by no means insignificant market. Sega wouldn't be the only new challenger amidst the now once more growing gaming industry, however.
You are about to witness the future in video game entertainment. The TurboGrafx 16 Entertainment Super System. 16-bit power, arcade quality graphics, and an unbeatable selection of titles. We'll show you what's available now and sneak previews of what's coming.
Hudson Soft and NEC's TurboGrafx 16 released in 1987 in Japan under the name PC Engine, and in 1989 in America and Europe. The console was so eager to let consumers know that it was a 16-bit rather than 8-bit system that it included it in the name, kicking off what is sometimes referred to as the Bit Wars, as well as the fourth generation of home consoles. As the first truly next-gen system, the TurboGrafx did boast some impressive hardware, with a higher resolution and expanded color palette to go alongside its 16-bit GPU. This was matched with some impressive sales in its home region of Japan, with the system getting off to a flying start and beating out the NES in its year of release. Unfortunately, this strong performance wasn't replicated in other regions, with poor marketing and a delayed release leading to commercial failure in North America and cancelled plans in Europe. Still, for Sega, this new competition represented a clear threat, and so, in response, they immediately began working on their own 16-bit system. It was finished 1 year later, long before Nintendo would have a 16-bit system themselves, and it turned out to be Sega's best console yet.
What's the hottest 16-bit video game system with true arcade games, great graphics, real challenge, stereo sound, and the hottest library too, with games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Super Hang-On, Forgotten Worlds, Space Harrier 2, Revenge of Shinobi, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Buxton, Last Battle, Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, Super Thunderblade, Zoom, Thunder Force 2, Ghouls and Ghosts, Mystic Defender, Rambo 3, and more? Genesis from Sega. Genesis, the new generation in video games.
The Sega Genesis, otherwise known as the Mega Drive outside America, released in 1988 in Japan, 1989 in America, and 1990 in other regions. And with it, Sega now had a system powerful enough to do justice to their expansive arcade library, as well as a clear technological lead on their main rival Nintendo. They even had a new marketing slogan.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Columns free. What Nintendo don't. Buy a 16-bit Genesis.
And so, heading into the next decade, the console war was finally heating up, with one of gaming's greatest rivalries about to unfold. The only thing Sega still needed was a killer app of their own that could finally go head-to-head with Nintendo's popular mascot Mario. But for Nintendo, there was no reason to panic just yet, as the end of the 80s saw them release a new system of their own, one that would go on to outsell all of their previous systems combined. Nintendo's Game & Watch was a success, but its LCD technology limited it to one game per system. For Gunpei Yokoi's next console, he wanted to create a handheld device with interchangeable games that offered an NES-like experience on the go. This was the result.
They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Game Boy comes complete with batteries and the outrageous new game Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use Video Link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
The Game Boy released in 1989 and was around in various iterations for the next 20 years, during which Nintendo dominated the handheld market the entire time. It did require 4 AA batteries, but this was a price players were more than happy to pay. It also lacked a backlight, which was more of an issue. A contrast dial was included, but this still meant the system was unplayable without a light source, and even in a well-lit environment, the grey and green colour scheme didn't provide the best clarity or general aesthetic. To make matters worse, the Game Boy released against heavy competition, with 3 other handhelds also vying for dominance at the same time: Atari's Lynx, Sega's Game Gear, and NEC's Turbo Express. All 3 of these rivals blew the Game Boy away in technical capabilities, featuring not only a backlit screen, but also full colour and far more impressive graphics. By comparison, the drab greys and greens of the Game Boy must have seemed rather pathetic, a sentiment held by many even at Nintendo during its development, where the Game Boy had earned the nickname Dame Game, a pun which basically translates to bad game. In the end though, the Game Boy wound up punching far above its weight and easily surpassed all competition, proving that in the constantly advancing battleground of cutting-edge technology that is the gaming industry, sometimes having the best specs isn't what matters the most. You see, in return for a less technologically advanced product, Nintendo offered something at a more affordable price, with a much longer battery life, and a durable, more child-proof design. If success was down to critics, the Game Boy would have come last. In reality, however, success is decided by the consumer, which in this case often meant parents. And it turned out that in this example, practicality and affordability beat superior technology, and it wasn't even close. For Gunpei Yokoi, this must have been the ultimate vindication of his design philosophy, which has been translated as lateral thinking with withered technology, i.e., achieving success through finding new and innovative ways to use cheap or mature technology. In an industry obsessed with the cutting edge, this has been successfully employed by Nintendo time and time again, and despite Yokoi's unfortunate death in 1997, his philosophy can still be seen within the company to this day. Of course, this is only part of the Game Boy's success story, because it also had another advantage over the competition. Designed inside the Soviet Union by Alexei Pachinov in 1984, Tetris began life as more of a benchmark than an actual video game. In a time long before anyone could ask, can it play Crysis, computer engineer Pachinov had to settle for developing his own games as a way to test the capabilities of the latest hardware. The idea for Tetris came from trying to recreate the puzzle game Pentominoes, when Pachinov had the idea to make the pieces descend vertically. The lack of a graphical interface on the Electronica 60 Pachinov was working on did pose a slight problem, but it wasn't enough to stop Tetris's core idea from being enjoyable, and soon Pachinov was sharing his creation with his friends, and eventually making an IBM PC version with the help of a talented 16-year-old school student. From here, Tetris spread like a contagious virus, first infecting Pachinov's office, then the whole Academy of Science, before moving across Moscow, and then beyond, doing what few Soviet citizens of the time could do, and crossing the Iron Curtain. This kicked off a race from multiple eager parties to acquire the rights of the game for broader distribution in the West. The only problem with the situation was that the Soviet Union didn't really believe in copyright law outside of everything should be controlled by the state, leading to confusion over who owned the rights of the game and a complicated battle between different competing parties, with plenty of buying and selling of rights that sellers didn't actually own. The ultimate winner was game designer Henk Rogers, who acquired the rights for Nintendo. The original plan for the Game Boy was to sell it alongside the new Mario title, Super Mario Land, but Nintendo was so impressed by Tetris after Rogers showed it to them that they followed his advice to use it instead, in the hopes that its simple, addictive nature could transcend experience, age, and gender barriers to be a game that everyone could enjoy. And it was. At first glance, Tetris might seem similar to popular arcade games of 10 years earlier, but with no concerns about maximizing quarters, Tetris considerably lowered the initial difficulty, and this did result in a game that anyone could play, as it eased people into the experience while naturally building tension and excitement as the game progressed. Tetris required fast moment-to-moment reactions, as well as broader, more strategic planning, and when players made a mistake, it was obvious where they went wrong and what they could do better next time. For the pick-up-and-play Game Boy, it was a perfect match, and it went on to sell tens of millions of copies on Nintendo's new system alone, as well as many millions more across PC, NES, and later mobile versions, making it, potentially, the best-selling game ever made, even to this day. This helped the Game Boy get off to a strong start right from its launch, which meant as the 80s grew to a close, Nintendo retained their dominant position as leaders of the gaming industry, having far surpassed Atari and held off a new challenge presented by Sega. All this time, however, as console and arcade giants rose and fell, another section of the industry experienced its own story, one with a different starting place, different games, and a very different impact on the future. World War II was kind of a big deal. In addition to deciding the fate of a global population and shaping the modern world as we know it, it also saw rapid technological advancement that would pave the way for something equally important: the home computer. Originally, computer game development was limited to only the most enthusiastic hobbyists. This started in the early 70s, with one of the first and most well-known examples being 1971's Star Trek, a text-based strategy game where players took control of the USS Enterprise to hunt down Klingon warships. Other early examples include Oregon Trail, a text-based strategy game best known via its later incarnations, 1976's Colossal Cave Adventure, a text-based adventure game inspired by real-life caving and Dungeons & Dragons, 1977's Empire, a turn-based wargame inspired by the board game Risk, Zork, also in 1977 and also a text-based adventure game inspired by Colossal Cave Adventure, and Mud, or Multi-User Dungeon, a text-based real-time multiplayer role-playing game that helped pioneer the MMO genre in 1978. Of these 6 examples, all except Colossal Cave Adventure were created by students. In fact, Star Trek was created by a high school student who had started hanging around the University of California Irvine's computer lab in his free time. So, for computer games, it was teenagers who led the way. Maybe due to the younger generation's inherent creativity, but also because computers were so expensive that university students were some of the only people who had reliable access to them. This started to change in 1977 with the arrival of not 1 but 3 more affordable home computers: the Commodore PET, the TRS-80, and the Apple II. If you want to know what affordable means in numerical form, well, the most successful of these, the Apple II, cost $1,298 at release, which is over $6,400 after inflation. So, maybe not affordable for most, but it was a start. These early computers tended to ship with some games included, but they also came with something else. BASIC, a general-purpose programming language that gave computer owners not just the ability to play games, but also to make them themselves. And they did. The best-known example of this is Sierra Online, founded by husband and wife duo Ken and Roberta Williams, after playing Colossal Cave Adventure and deciding to make their own similar game on a family member's borrowed Apple II. The result was the first ever graphical adventure game, Mystery House, a murder mystery-focused game inspired by Agatha Christie novels and one of the earliest examples of both graphics in a PC game and horror in any video game. Sierra Online went on to have numerous hits, including King's Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, and Quest for Glory. Another example is Akalabeth, the first ever computer role-playing game made by a teenage Richard Garriott in 1979, originally on his school's mainframe PC and finished on an Apple II bought by his father. Garriott sold the game at his local computer store in a Ziploc bag with a cover sheet drawn by his mum, until a copy of the game made it to California Pacific Computer Company, who signed a deal with Garriott to take over publication and sold 30,000 copies. The founders of Codemasters, the Darling brothers, have a similar story, where they became wealthy and established game developers by the ripe old age of 16 and 17, selling games by mail order from their bedroom. Arcade and console gaming became corporate almost as soon as it came into existence, but by contrast, the computer gaming industry was heavily grassroots, with hobbyists, bedroom coders, and literal children often leading the way, laying the foundations for the entire industry and proving just what these new home computers were capable of. This did mean the PC scene was much slower to monetize their efforts, with piracy, known at the time as sharing, being such common practice that many people weren't even aware it could be considered wrong. And what started as sharing between friends quickly evolved into selling bootleg copies for a fraction of the original price. The differences between computer and console gaming doesn't stop here though. From the higher age of the average player, to the higher price of the systems, to the vastly different control schemes, to regional differences, with PC gaming particularly flourishing in Europe, the same region where consoles caught on the slowest, PC gaming basically grew up independently to the rest of the gaming industry, and nowhere is this more evident than in actual game design. Arcade games started off simple. They were highly replayable and fiendishly challenging, in large part due to their monetization, and they tended to focus on skill-based gameplay experiences that came alongside arcade-specific features, like high scores and lives. Console games then grew out of this foundation, with Atari and Sega owing much of their console success to their arcade ports, and the NES's library being packed with games which emulated many aspects of popular arcade titles of the era. PC games, however, were quick to embrace complexity. Text adventures like Zork gave players a staggering amount of freedom in their text inputs, while MUDs did similar while adding in other human players as well. 1980s genre pioneer Rogue offered a huge randomly generated world for players to progress through. Groundbreaking RPGs like 1981's Wizardry or Ultima provided deep, dungeon-crawling, overworld-spanning adventures with plenty of statistics, classes, and items. In many of these titles, gameplay seemed to take a back seat to trying to simulate a rich virtual world for players to become immersed in. Many of these games were still highly challenging, but less emphasis was placed on constant fail states and replayability, with difficulty instead often coming from depth. And low-fidelity visuals, be they text, ASCII, or spreadsheet, were often embraced as a way to provide greater freedom, and maybe as a way for programmers to avoid learning to draw or hiring artists. In time, many of these differentiators would become less clear, as the borders between PC and console would gradually erode, with Japanese role-playing games being an obvious example of cross-pollination. But this process occurred slowly, and many of these same differences between computer games and their console cousins are still evident today. Still, as the 80s evolved, so too did the home computer, with systems becoming more affordable amidst rising competition.
It seems everybody is interested now in home computers. Well, so far, home computers are just a small fraction of those being sold in the United States. But because our technology is growing by leaps and bounds, computers can help us with a lot of household items, for grown-ups as well as for the kids.
The next generation of computers would include the ZX series from Sinclair, NEC's PC series, the Atari 8-bit family, the BBC Micro, and the Amstrad CPC. The best-selling of these was the Commodore 64, which released just under $600 and holds the world record as the highest-selling single computer model of all time. At the same time as this, computing heavyweight IBM launched their now iconic personal computer series, popularizing the term PC. These came with Microsoft's DOS operating system and supported open software development for the first time. Before this, all home computers were incompatible systems, meaning all programs had to be ported to specific systems to meet the individual hardware requirements of each one. The IBM PC, and its many subsequent clones, instead allowed software to be ported much more easily, which ultimately greatly benefited game development. Hardware wasn't the only thing improving in this period though. By the mid-80s, PC games were also making impressive strides. 1984's King Quest from Sierra showed the evolution of the graphic adventure genre with an animated protagonist and interactive world. Space Sim Elite broke new ground by adding advanced 3D graphics and action gameplay into an incredibly deep and open space sandbox. Ultima 4 in 1985 set a new standard for role-playing games by moving them beyond their established dungeon crawler formula with a more expansive world, a richer, more nuanced story, and a new moral choice-driven approach to game design. 1987's Dungeon Master, on the other hand, evolved the dungeon crawler into the realm of 3D, with added real-time combat elements. The 80s also saw the merging of entertainment and education in several fondly remembered edutainment games. The 1985 version of The Oregon Trail taught children history, as well as the dangers of dysentery, typhoid, and rivers. While the also released in 1985 Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego taught geography and the dangers of art theft. Of course, The Oregon Trail was also an enjoyable strategy game with genuine emergent storytelling and roguelike random generation, years before Rogue even existed. And Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego was a very well-made adventure game with strong replayability. In some ways, the educational elements of such games were light, but that didn't stop them showing up in thousands of schools, tricking children into learning, or tricking teachers into letting children play games during school, depending on your perspective. Ultimately, edutainment computer games were a trend which didn't really catch on, but they still serve as a valuable reminder of a time when gaming was in its infancy and developers were exploring novel applications of this new exciting medium. By the end of the 80s, the era of bedroom coders was coming to a close, with husband and wife duos and pioneering teenagers soon being replaced or going on to found legitimate development teams with professional work environments. One such company, Electronic Arts, would see a major breakthrough with their 1988 John Madden Football, a game which would not only kick off one of the industry's largest sports series, but also showed the more mainstream direction PC games were now heading in. 1988 also saw the release of Pool of Radiance, the first in a long line of gold box Dungeons & Dragons RPGs, where after years of video games taking inspiration from D&D, they were now finally starting to make that relationship official. With home computers continuing to become more affordable, PC gaming ended the decade in a promising place. Its early years should perhaps best be remembered as a time of innovation and enthusiasm. The computer gaming market started small. Popularity was created through word of mouth and sharing between friends. Creators enjoyed unprecedented levels of creative freedom, and monetization was often a distant afterthought. Yet many of the games produced from this era were just as impressive as their console and arcade rivals, albeit often in very different ways. Regardless, the impact of these games on the industry was considerable, and gaming wasn't the only thing they impacted. In a time where the personal computer was a brand new invention, computer games also played a significant role in showcasing just what this new piece of technology could do, and in popularizing the idea that a computer could be more than just a machine for work. And so, even if the history of computer games stands somewhat separate to the rest of the industry, it still played a vital role, and its importance would only grow as the years went by. Gaming's early years were tumultuous, with lawsuits, bankruptcy, and corporate takeovers coming alongside innovations and breakthroughs, all while technology progressed at breakneck speeds, leaving both software and hardware behind after only a few years. Within this chaos, the video game industry rose, fell, and then finally rose again. And each time, there was a connection to the quality of the games. First with the novelty of Pong, before the industry got smothered in an abundance of Pong clones, then with the golden age of the arcade, and Atari's move to bring that golden age to consoles, before a mass of low-quality, cheaply produced games once more sunk Atari and much of the industry with them, and then finally with Nintendo, bringing new life to the industry with their higher standard of quality and groundbreaking flagship series. The evolution of the gaming industry wasn't exactly smooth, but by the end of the 80s, video games had come a long way. In 1972, there was Pong. In 1989, Prince of Persia on the Apple II used rotoscoping technology to produce smooth, true-to-life animations. Shadow of the Beast on the Amiga combined detailed sprite work with parallax scrolling to create stunning backgrounds. Final Fight on arcades upped the level of detail and the amount of things on screen at once to seriously impressive levels. And even on consoles, the new generation of 16-bit systems was starting to really show what those 16 bits could do, with games like Golden Axe providing much better visuals than was seen in the last generation. And it wasn't just graphics. On the NES, developers' experience with designing games and their familiarity with the system was also showing dividends. Take the opening of the famously difficult action platformer, Ninja Gaiden. Sound, visuals, and cinematic style are all combined masterfully here to create some really compelling storytelling that draws players in and contextualizes what you actually do in-game. And it does all this in less than a minute. Meanwhile, on PC, games like the city builder SimCity or God game Populous were once more treading new ground and creating new genres that challenged how people thought about video games. Still, if you really want to see how far games had come, no single title illustrated it better than the latest entry in Nintendo's most iconic series. Widely considered one of the greatest games ever made, and as close to perfect as a sequel can be, Super Mario Bros. 3 is the pinnacle of the NES library, and it still holds up all these years later. Where some NES sequels went in bold new directions, not always with the best results, the third game in the Super Mario series instead takes everything which worked about the first title and does it bigger and better. From the new overworld to multiple new power-ups, new enemies, larger levels, enhanced visuals, an expanded moveset, multiplayer, and a much longer runtime, it was a game which did quite a bit to impress. But what shined brightest of all was its creative level design. Every world had its own theme, every stage felt distinct, and new things were introduced constantly, with the player never quite sure what to expect next. Somehow, in just 3 years since the first game, the team behind Super Mario Bros. 3 worked out how to make the perfect 2D Mario game, and then they did it. Games had come a long way. But this story doesn't end here. From gaming's greatest rivalry, to PC's biggest breakthrough, to the annihilation of the competition by gaming's next major entrant, to a whole plethora of gaming's all-time greats, video games were just getting started, and the story would continue in the 90s. Thank you for watching. That next video shouldn't be too far off, by the way. I guess whatever break I was taking is now over, so I hope you like video game history, because there's still a way to go. If you're not subscribed to my other channel, there are some new videos since I've last uploaded here. The last video got age restricted for no reason, so it didn't get many views, but it's still well worth watching, and it's about everyone's favourite subject: politics. Otherwise, I'm back to focusing on this channel and video games, with a lot planned in the future. So support me on Patreon if you want to throw away your money and make me happy, and otherwise, I will see you in the 90s.